Get more ice. Don't stand there like a statue while your brother saves this family. Mother shooed me away, her glass clinking like her shattering finances. I hid my Patek Philippe under my cheap sleeve. They had no idea the senior partner my brother had bragged about was the daughter they forced to sleep in the pantry. In 3 minutes, I would teach them a permanent lesson: the debt holder always owns the soul. My name is Priscilla Claymore, and to the 3 people occupying the luxury suite of the Ritz-Carlton alongside me, I was less significant than the floral arrangement on the sidebar. In fact, the lilies probably commanded more respect. At least they were expected to be seen. I, on the other hand, was designed to be invisible. The conference room smelled of lemon polish and desperation. It was a high-end scent, the kind that costs $2,000 a night to rent, but underneath the crisp air conditioning, I could smell the sweat of a family on the brink of total collapse. Straighten your back, Preston. You look like you are asking for a loan, not offering a partnership. My father, Conrad Claymore, barked. He reached out and aggressively tugged at the lapels of Preston's navy blue suit. It was a bespoke piece, likely charged to a credit card that was already 3 months over its limit. I stood by the wet bar, a linen napkin in my hand, wiping away a microscopic ring of condensation left by the ice bucket. This was my station. I had been explicitly instructed not to sit at the long, oval mahogany table. That space was for the partners, my mother had said, her voice dripping with a sickly sweet condescension. Priscilla, stop hovering. My mother, Victoria, snapped without looking at me. She was busy using a lint roller on Preston's shoulder, treating him like a prize stallion about to be paraded at an auction. Check the water glasses again. They must be perfectly aligned. Presentation is everything, God knows. If we left it to you, we would be drinking out of paper cups. I did not reply. I simply moved to the table and adjusted the coasters by a fraction of an inch. My face remained a mask of dull obedience. Inside, however, my mind was running a ticker tape of numbers. The suit Preston was wearing cost $4,000. The room rental was $2,500. The champagne chilling in the bucket, which they could not afford, was $300 a bottle. The Claymore family was technically bankrupt. I knew this because I was the one who secretly bought their debt. But looking at them now, you would never guess. They were masters of the masquerade. Preston cleared his throat, puffing out his chest. He looked every bit the part of the young, dynamic venture capitalist he pretended to be. He had the jawline, the hair, and the smile. The only thing he lacked was a brain and a conscience. Gentlemen, Preston began, addressing the empty leather chairs opposite him. He was rehearsing, again. I am thrilled to welcome Meridian Sovereign Holdings to the table. As the new partner, I envision a synergy that will redefine the Chicago market. My portfolio speaks for itself. I bit the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing. His portfolio consisted of 3 failed startups, a lawsuit for workplace harassment that father had paid to hush up, and a gambling habit that had swallowed my college fund 10 years ago. Preston paused and looked at me, a smirk curling his lip. How was that? Scylla too complex for you. I know things get confused in that little head of yours when we talk about numbers bigger than a grocery bill. It sounded very confident, I said, my voice flat. Confident, he scoffed, turning back to the mirror on the wall to admire his reflection. That is why I am the visionary, and you are the bean counter. You stay in your cubicle, checking spreadsheets, while the big boys shape the world. Honestly, Mother, why is she even here? She kills the vibe. Victoria walked over to the window, looking down at the sprawling city of Chicago. Her fingers were gripping her clutch so tightly her knuckles were white. She is here to learn. Preston, perhaps if she observes how men of caliber conduct business, she might find herself a husband who can elevate her out of mediocrity. Besides, we need someone to pour the water. We cannot have the staff coming in and out. It interrupts the flow. I looked at my mother. The layers of foundation on her face were thick, but they could not hide the deep lines of anxiety etched around her mouth. She was terrified. They all were. They had leveraged everything, absolutely everything, on this deal. The historic Claymore Villa in the suburbs, the last asset that had not been seized, was the collateral for the bridge loan they had taken to pay for this show. They thought they were securing an investment. They did not know they were walking into an execution. My father checked his watch. It was a Rolex he had bought in 1998, back when the Claymore steel mills were actually producing steel instead of rust. His hand was trembling. It was a subtle tremor, but I saw it. He clasped his hands behind his back to hide the weakness. "They will be here in 5 minutes," Conrad said, his voice tight. "Remember, Preston, do not agree to the first term sheet. We need to appear liquid. We need to appear as if we have options." "I know, Dad. Relax," Preston said, though a bead of sweat was already forming at his hairline. "I have this in the bag. They came to me. Remember, they want the Claymore name." The Claymore name. It was worthless. It was a liability. The only reason anyone in Chicago still took their calls was because of the illusion of old money, but illusions are expensive to maintain. I retreated to the corner of the room, blending into the beige wallpaper. I slipped my phone out of my pocket. It was a secure device, not the cracked iPhone 6 I carried to maintain my cover as a struggling administrative assistant. I tapped the screen. A message was waiting for me. "Asset in position. Entering the elevator now. E.T." 2 minutes. I glanced up at my family. My brother was checking his teeth in the reflection of a spoon. My mother was reapplying lipstick for the 3rd time. My father was pacing the length of the rug, muttering numbers that did not add up. They looked like royalty. They looked like the masters of the universe. But from where I stood, in the shadows they had cast me into, they looked exactly like what they were, puppets. And they had no idea that the person pulling the strings was standing right behind them, holding a pitcher of ice water. "Put the phone away." "Priscilla," Mother hissed, spotting the device in my hand. "Do not embarrass us with your addiction to social media. Look professional. For heaven's sake." "Yes, Mother," I said softly, sliding the phone back into my pocket. The elevator chimed in the hallway. The heavy oak doors of the suite vibrated slightly. "Showtime," Preston whispered, buttoning his jacket. "Watch and weep, little sister. You're about to see how the other half lives." I smoothed down my skirt and clasped my hands in front of me. "I am watching. Preston," I thought. "I am watching very closely." As I watched Preston practice his handshake with the air, I could map the trajectory of every bad decision that had led us to this room, to my parents. Preston was a venture capitalist in waiting, a dormant volcano of success just waiting for the right eruption. To the rest of the financial world, he was a radioactive isotope. The divergence in our paths had started 20 years ago. It began with the tuition checks. For Preston, there was the prestigious preparatory academy on the North Shore, costing $40,000 a year. For me, there was the local public high school, where the textbooks were held together by duct tape and hope. They told me it was because I was independent and resilient. They told Preston it was because he needed nurturing and connections. The connections, as it turned out, were mostly with bartenders and bookies. I looked at the back of his head, remembering the first company he destroyed. It was 6 years ago. He had this brilliant idea for a luxury pet food delivery service. My father liquidated a significant portion of his retirement portfolio to fund it $200,000, handed over with a smile and a pat on the back. Preston burned through it in 6 months. He spent $50,000 on a launch party, where he hired minor celebrities to take photos with bespoke dog biscuits, and another $30,000 on an office in the Loop that he didn't need. When the company folded, my mother did not scold him. She poured him a scotch and said, "The market just wasn't ready for premium organic kibble. Darling, you were too ahead of your time." Then came the tech startup, then the boutique real estate firm. The pattern was always the same. Preston would have a vision. Father would write a check. The money would vanish into thin air, usually converted into designer suits, first-class flights, and nights out that he couldn't remember the next morning. And every single time, it was someone else's fault. The developers were lazy. The economy was sluggish. The partners were jealous of his charisma. I was the control group in this twisted experiment. While Preston was crashing Porsches, he didn't own. I was working double shifts at a diner to pay for my community college textbooks when I landed a job as a junior analyst at a mid-tier firm. My father sighed and said, "Well, at least it is safe. Priscilla, not everyone has the stomach for high-stakes leadership like your brother. Someone has to do the paperwork." They saw a clerk. They saw a gray mouse shuffling papers. They had no idea that the mouse was actually a viper. I didn't just work in finance. I dominated it, under a pseudonym. I had built a reputation in the distressed asset market that made grown men weep. I was the silent partner behind 3 of the largest hostile takeovers in Chicago in the last 4 years. I understood leverage in a way Preston never could. He thought leverage was about borrowing money. I knew leverage was about finding the one thing a person cannot afford to lose, and then holding it over a cliff. My eyes drifted to Preston's hands. They were trembling slightly. Despite his bravado, I knew why. I knew the numbers he was hiding from mother and father. Preston wasn't just broke. He was underwater. He owed $85,000 to credit card companies, and another $120,000 to a private loan shark in the South Side, who didn't send overdue notices. He sent men with baseball bats. That was why he was so desperate for this deal with Meridian Sovereign Holdings. He needed the signing bonus to keep his kneecaps intact. He had told our parents that Meridian approached him. He said they had scouted him. Recognizing his untapped genius, the truth was far more pathetic. I knew because I was the one who read his application. Meridian Sovereign Holdings was my shell company. I created it 2 years ago to acquire failing industrial assets without alerting the market to my involvement. When I saw Preston's resume land in the general inbox 2 months ago, soliciting an investment partnership, I almost deleted it. But then, I paused. I remembered the red convertible. It was 10 years ago. I had saved every penny from 4 years of waitressing and tutoring. $42,000. It was my ticket to an MBA program, my escape velocity from the Claymore madness. I kept the bank book hidden in a hollowed-out dictionary in my room. One afternoon, I came home to find the book on my bed, empty, outside, in the driveway. Preston was revving the engine of a vintage red Mustang. My father was standing there, beaming, a glass of wine in his hand. "Look at that beast," Father had said, ignoring the tears streaming down my face. "Your brother needs to look the part to get his foot in the door at the club. Priscilla, we borrowed your savings. Consider it a family investment. When he strikes it big, he will pay you back with interest." "You stole it," I had whispered. "Don't be dramatic," Mother had snapped from the porch. "You can always wait tables for another year. Preston has a window of opportunity right now. Do not be selfish." They never paid me back. Preston crashed the car 3 weeks later while driving drunk. Father paid the police off to keep it out of the papers. My $42,000 turned into a pile of scrap metal and a hush money bribe. I didn't scream. I didn't fight. That was the day I stopped being their daughter and started being their creditor. I realized that if I wanted justice, I wouldn't get it by asking. I would have to buy it. So, when Preston's application came across my desk, I didn't reject it. I flagged it. I instructed my team to engage him. I told them to feed his ego, to promise him a partnership level that usually requires 20 years of experience. I told them to ask for a capital contribution that I knew he didn't have. I wanted to see what he would do. I wanted to see who he would sacrifice when the bill finally came due. And just as I predicted, here we were. He had dragged our aging parents into this room, ready to bleed them dry one last time to save his own skin. He was going to feed them to the wolves to cover his gambling debts, and he was going to call it business. "You know," Preston said. Breaking my train of thought, he adjusted his cufflinks, looking at me in the reflection of the window. "After this deal closes, I think I will buy a boat. Something sleek. Maybe we can take the family out on the lake. If you're lucky, I might even let you steer for a minute." "That sounds nice." "Preston," I said, "boats are expensive to maintain. Though, expense is a mindset for poor people. Priscilla. He chuckled, shaking his head at my ignorance. When you operate at my level, money is just a tool. You wouldn't understand. I looked down at the floor to hide the cold smile that was fighting to appear on my face. He was right. Money was a tool, and I was about to use it to dismantle him, piece by arrogant piece. He thought he was swimming towards a lifeboat, but he failed to realize that I was the ocean, and I had decided it was time for a storm. Meridian Sovereign Holdings was not designed to be a standard investment firm. It was constructed as a mirror maze, a labyrinth of shell corporations and offshore entities designed to obscure the identity of the architect at its center. To the outside world, it was a boutique hedge fund with aggressive growth strategies and an exclusive, almost hermetic, client list to the state regulators. It was a perfectly compliant limited liability company registered in Delaware with a board of directors that existed largely on paper. To me, however, it was a hunting blind. The trap had been baited exactly 60 days ago. When Preston submitted his application, he thought he was reaching for a brass ring. He did not realize he was sticking his hand into a bear trap. The terms of the partnership offer were drafted with surgical precision. I had spent 3 nights refining the contract clauses, ensuring they were enticing enough to blind him with greed, but strict enough to be his undoing. The headline offer was a salaried position of $300,000 a year, plus a 20% equity stake in all future acquisitions managed by his division. It was the kind of offer that would make a man like Preston drool. But then came the fine print, the capital contribution clause. To demonstrate skin in the game and commitment to the firm's shared risk philosophy, the incoming partner was required to deposit a buy-in of $250,000 in liquid cash upon signing. $250,000. I chose that number after carefully analyzing the family's remaining liquidity. I knew exactly what was in their accounts because I had been monitoring them for years. I knew they did not have $250,000 sitting in a checking account. I knew their stocks were pledged, their credit cards were maxed out, and their cash flow was non-existent. To get that kind of money, they would have to bleed. They would have to liquidate the only things that mattered to them. A rational person would have looked at that requirement, checked their bank balance, and walked away. But I was not dealing with a rational person. I was dealing with a narcissist who had already sold the skin of the bear before he had even bought the gun. Preston had made the fatal mistake of bragging. Within 48 hours of receiving the preliminary interest letter from Meridian, Preston had broadcast the news to every social circle in Chicago that mattered. He had told the bartender at the Chicago Yacht Club that he was moving into private equity. He had posted vague, self-congratulatory updates on LinkedIn about embarking on a monumental new chapter with industry titans. He had even booked a table at Alinea for next week to celebrate a victory he had not yet secured. He had leveraged his reputation on a lie. If he failed to close this deal, if he had to admit that he could not come up with the buy-in money, he would be exposed as a fraud. The humiliation would be absolute. In the Claymore family, shame was a fate worse than death. He had to sign. He had no choice. To ensure he remained in a state of high-anxiety desperation, I had instructed my team to implement a stress test protocol. For the last month, we had subjected Preston to a rigorous, invasive, and entirely fabricated due diligence process. My employees, communicating through encrypted emails and scheduled calls from burner numbers, demanded endless documentation. We asked for his tax returns from the last 5 years. We asked for character references. We asked for a business plan detailing how he would allocate the firm's capital. It was comedy to watch him scramble. He paid a consultant $4,000 to write the business plan because he did not know how to construct a cash flow projection. He forged signatures on his character references because his former business partners were currently suing him. Every time he sent a document, my team would wait exactly 6 hours and then reply with a request for clarification or additional data. We kept him off balance. We made him feel like he was always one step away from being rejected, which made him want it even more. But the masterstroke was not the buy-in. The masterstroke was the debt. while Preston was busy photoshopping bank statements to impress Meridian. I was busy shopping on the secondary debt market. Most people do not realize that debt is a product that is bought and sold just like corn or soybeans. When a bank holds a mortgage that is consistently late, or a business loan that looks risky, they will often bundle it and sell it to debt collectors or specialized funds for pennies on the dollar to clear it off their books. Over the last 18 months, I had been quietly acquiring the Claymore family debt. I used a subsidiary called Northwind Capital to purchase the mortgage on the family estate. The bank was happy to unload it. My parents had refinanced the house 3 times and were currently 60 days behind on payments. I used another entity, Blue Harbor Assets, to buy up the outstanding notes on Preston's failed business loans. I even bought the debt from the credit card issuers. Technically, as I stood in that conference room wiping the water glass, I was not just their daughter or sister, I was their landlord, their banker, and their collection agency. I owned the roof over their heads. I owned the cars in their garage. I owned the clothes on their backs. They believed they were negotiating with a stranger named Silas, who represented a faceless conglomerate. They did not understand that the conglomerate was a fiction, and the reality was standing 5 feet away from them. I checked the time on the wall clock. The minute hand was sweeping toward the hour. The beauty of this trap was its legality. There was no coercion. I was simply offering a partnership at a specific price, if they chose to pay that price by making a foolish financial decision. That was the free market at work. If they chose to mortgage their future to buy a title they did not deserve, that was their prerogative. I looked at my father. He was whispering to Preston, likely reassuring him that the money transfer would clear, that they could move funds around, that they could rob Peter to pay Paul one last time. He did not know that Paul was already in the room, and she was done waiting. The setup was complete. The stage was dressed. The actors had learned their lines, even if they did not understand the play. All that was left was for the executioner to walk through the door and drop the blade. I smoothed the front of my skirt and took a deep breath. Centering myself, the analytical part of my brain, the part that dealt in risk ratios and liquidation preferences, was humming with quiet efficiency. There was no anger anymore. Anger is messy. Anger causes you to make mistakes. This was cold. Hard accounting. The balance sheet of the Claymore family was about to be reconciled, and I was the only one holding the red pen. The heavy oak doors of the conference suite did not just open, they were breached. Precisely at 3 o'clock. The handle turned, and the air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Silas walked in. I had hired Silas 3 years ago from a top-tier litigation firm in New York. He was 60 years old, with silver hair that looked like it had been spun from steel wire and a face that could curdle milk. He was wearing a charcoal 3-piece suit that cost more than my brother's car. And he carried himself with the heavy, silent gravity of a man who knew where all the bodies were buried because he had dug the graves himself. He did not look at me. He did not even blink in my direction. He walked past the wet bar where I stood as if I were a piece of furniture. His gaze fixed like a laser on the 3 people sitting at the mahogany table. My mother let out a small, satisfied breath. She took his dismissal of me as a sign of his pedigree. In her world, important men did not notice the help, and she was relieved that he had correctly identified my station in this hierarchy. She nudged my father under the table, a subtle signal to straighten his tie. "Mr. Claymore," Silas said. His voice was a deep baritone, devoid of any warmth. It was a voice designed to read verdicts, not bedtime stories. He extended a hand toward Preston. My brother stood up, wiping his palm on his trousers a split second before taking the grip. It was a rookie mistake. You never let the opponent know you are sweating. Silas held the handshake a beat too long. He wasn't shaking hands. He was weighing the merchandise. His eyes, pale blue and unblinking, raked over Preston's face, cataloging the nervous tick in his left eyelid and the way his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "Mr. Silas," Preston stammered, his voice cracking slightly before he found his false baritone. A pleasure. I have heard well. We have all heard incredible things about Meridian. It is an honor to welcome you to the inner circle. Silas released his hand without smiling. We shall see. He took the seat at the head of the table, my father's usual spot, which Conrad had vacated in a rare moment of submission. Silas placed a briefcase on the table. It was black crocodile skin with gold hardware. The sound of it hitting the wood was heavy, like a gavel striking a bench. My father, sensing the power dynamic shifting too far in the stranger's favor, decided to intervene. He leaned back, crossing his legs and adopting the pose of the benevolent patriarch. You know, Silas, Conrad began, using the man's first name without invitation, a clumsy attempt to manufacture intimacy. The Claymore family has been a pillar of Chicago industry for 80 years. We value tradition. We value honor. When Preston told us about this partnership, I told him that Meridian is lucky to align itself with a name that carries such weight. We are not just offering capital, we are offering a legacy. Silas turned his head slowly to look at my father. He looked at him the way a scientist looks at a bacteria sample in a petri dish. Legacies do not pay the light bill, Mr. Claymore, Silas said, and history does not accrue interest. The silence that followed was absolute. My father's mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. He was not used to being interrupted. He was certainly not used to being irrelevant. We are here for a transaction, Silas continued, unbuttoning his jacket with precise movements. Time is a finite resource, and mine is expensive. Let us dispense with the pleasantries. We are here to close the Stage 1 equity buy-in for the junior partner track. I assume the liquidity is confirmed. Of course, Preston said quickly, too quickly. Everything is in order. We are just finalizing the logistics. I did not ask about logistics, Silas cut him off. I asked about the money, $250,000, today. Priscilla. My mother's voice was sharp, cutting through the tension like a whip. Water, now, mister. Silas is parched. It was her reflex. When things got uncomfortable, she ordered me around to reestablish her sense of control. I picked up the crystal pitcher. It was heavy, filled with ice cubes that shifted against the glass. I walked toward the table, keeping my head down. This was my cue. I needed to be the nervous, incompetent sister. I needed them to focus on my clumsiness, so they would not notice the predator sitting right in front of them. I approached Silas first. As I poured the water into his goblet, I let my hand tremble. Just enough. The ice rattled against the glass rim, clink, 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 a sound of pure anxiety amplified in the quiet room. A few drops of water splashed onto the polished mahogany table, right next to the crocodile briefcase. Silas did not move. He ignored the spill completely, playing his part to perfection. But my mother gasped. Priscilla, for the love of God, look at what you are doing. She glared at me, her eyes burning with humiliation. I apologize, Mr. Silas, she said, her voice dripping with artificial charm. My daughter is not accustomed to high-level meetings. She is usually in the back office, clumsy hands. It is of no consequence, Silas said, waving a hand dismissively without looking at me. I am not here for the water service, I muttered a quiet apology, pulled a napkin from my pocket, and dabbed at the water, making sure to look suitably cowed. I retreated to the corner, my heart rate steady, my face burning with a fake shame that my family bought wholesale. Silas turned his attention back to Preston. He reached out and clicked the latches of his briefcase. Snap, snap. The sound echoed off the walls. He lifted the lid. Inside, there were no brochures, no marketing materials, no glossy photos of the Meridian headquarters. There was only a single, thin manila folder and a black fountain pen. The wire transfer coordinates were sent to your secure email this morning, Silas said, pulling the folder out. My compliance team is monitoring the account. As of 10 minutes ago, the balance was 0. He opened the folder and slid a single sheet of paper across the table toward Preston. It was face down. This is the confirmation of receipt, Silas said. Once the funds clear, you sign this, and you are a partner. If the funds do not clear in the next 20 minutes, I walk out that door, and the offer is rescinded permanently. Meridian does not do business with people who hesitate. Preston stared at the back of the paper. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. He looked at the paper as if it were a live grenade. 20 minutes, my father asked, his voice losing its bluster. That is a very tight window for a transfer of that magnitude. Banks have protocols. Then I suggest you get your banker on the phone, Silas said, checking his watch. You have 19 minutes left. The air in the room grew heavy, suffocating. I stood in the corner, clutching the water pitcher, watching the sweat break out on my brother's forehead. He looked at Dad. Dad looked at Mom. Mom looked at the expensive suit Preston was wearing, terrified that the costume was about to be stripped away. They were trapped, and the man with the crocodile briefcase was just starting to turn the screws. The silence in the room stretched thin, vibrating with the kind of tension that usually precedes a structural failure. Preston cleared his throat, a sound like dry leaves crinkling. He was stalling. I knew what he was saying, whenever he was about to lie. He would touch his tie knot, as if checking to see if the noose was tight enough. Mr. Silas, Preston began, his voice gaining a fragile sort of momentum. Before we get bogged down in the transactional minutiae, I want to walk you through the vision. The capital is merely the fuel. The engine is the strategy. He reached into his leather portfolio and pulled out a bound document. It was thick, glossy, and smelled of expensive toner. This is the strategic roadmap for the Q3 expansion. I have identified 3 key verticals in the logistics sector that are ripe for disruption. My analysis shows a projected ROI of 40% within the first 18 months. I recognized the jargon immediately. He had lifted it wholesale from a generic McKinsey report available online. He hadn't even bothered to change the font. Silas did not touch the document. He looked at it as if Preston had just placed a dead rat on the table. I am not interested in your roadmap, Mr. Claymore, Silas said, his voice level and dangerously calm. I am interested in your solvency. You can disrupt all the verticals you want, but you cannot buy into this firm with buzzwords. Preston's smile faltered. Of course. Solvency, right? He glanced at our father, seeking an anchor. Conrad gave him a curt nod, a silent command to proceed with the charade. The funds are accounted for, Preston said. He reached back into his bag, his movements jerky. In fact, I have the proof of liquidity right here. He withdrew a sheaf of papers. They were high-quality prints, featuring the logo of a major Swiss bank. The colors were vivid, the blue of the header, the black of the text. They looked impressive. They looked official. They were completely fake. From my vantage point in the corner, I narrowed my eyes. I didn't need to see the numbers to know they were fabricated. I had accessed his real accounts 3 hours ago. His checking account had a balance of negative $4,000. His savings account had been closed for inactivity 6 months ago. The only thing Preston had in abundance was overdraft fees. Here is the statement from my holding entity in Zurich, Preston said, sliding the papers across the mahogany table with a flourish intended to distract from the shaking of his hand. As you can see, the balance exceeds the required buy-in, $300,000, free and clear. Silas picked up the papers. He held them up to the light, squinting slightly. The room held its breath. Zurich, Silas murmured. Interesting choice. A bit theatrical for a domestic partnership buy-in. Wouldn't you say? We value privacy, my father interjected smoothly. The Claymore family has always maintained diversified holdings. It is simply good housekeeping. Indeed, Silas said. He placed the papers back on the table, smoothing them flat with his palm. But this is a statement of balance. Mr. Claymore, it is not a transfer confirmation. Where is the cash? Preston's Adam's apple bobbed. Ah, yes, the cash. Well, as you know, international wires can be temperamental. The funds are currently sitting in an escrow account. It is a standard compliance hold. They will be released and deposited into the Meridian account within 24 hours. Guaranteed. 24 hours, Silas repeated. He did not sound convinced. He sounded like a predator who had just smelled blood. It is a formality, Preston insisted, his voice rising an octave. The money is there. You have the paper right in front of you. Look at the date. It was printed this morning. Paper is patient. Mr. Claymore, Silas said. Paper will say whatever you print on it. My bank account, however, is very impatient. It demands digital confirmation. Are you questioning my son's integrity? Conrad's voice boomed. He stood up, his face flushing a deep, indignant red. It was a performance I had seen 1,000 times. When logic failed, he resorted to bluster. We are the Claymores. Our word has been currency in this city since before you were born. If Preston says the money is in escrow, the money is in escrow. Claymore's promise is worth more than gold. Gold is trading at $2,000 an ounce, Silas replied. Unbothered. Promises are currently trading at 0. He began to tap his finger on the table. Tap, tap, tap. It was a slow, rhythmic sound. It was the sound of a clock ticking down. It was psychological warfare, and it was working. I watched Preston. He had shoved his hands under the table to hide them. His knees were bouncing up and down so hard the water in his glass was rippling. He was terrified. He knew that if Silas made one phone call to verify that Swiss account number, the game was over. He would be exposed not just as broke, but as a criminal. Forging bank documents was wire fraud. I am not questioning his integrity, Silas said, stopping the tapping. I am questioning his liquidity. There is a difference. He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto Preston's. Here is the situation. My board meets in 45 minutes to finalize the partner roster. If your name is not on that list with a confirmed deposit, the spot goes to the next candidate. Mr. Sterling from New York. He wired his funds 2 days ago. Mr. Sterling, my mother gasped. But Preston was the first choice. He was, Silas said, until he wasn't. Preston looked like he was going to be sick. He looked at the fake bank statement, then at Silas, then at the door. He was looking for an exit, but there wasn't one. There must be a way to expedite this, Preston pleaded. A bridge, a temporary hold. I can write you a personal check right now to hold the spot until the wire clears tomorrow. A personal check. Silas raised an eyebrow. From a domestic account, I thought your funds were in Zurich. I have other accounts, Preston lied. Smaller ones, for operational expenses. No personal checks, Silas said firmly. We are not a grocery store. He checked his watch again. 15 minutes. You have 15 minutes to show me something real. Not paper, not promises, real assets, real collateral, or I walk. The air in the room seemed to vanish. My parents looked at each other, a silent communication of panic passing between them. They believed the lie. They truly believed the money was in Zurich, and this was just a technical glitch. They didn't know they were staring into a financial black hole, and I, the invisible girl in the corner, watched them teeter on the edge. I knew exactly what they would do next. Desperation is predictable. When you can't pay with cash, you pay with blood, or in this case, brick and mortar. Silas slid the glossy Swiss bank statement back across the table with a single finger. The paper made a dry, rasping sound against the wood, a sound that signaled rejection more final than any verbal no. I am afraid this is insufficient, Silas stated, his voice devoid of sympathy. As of 8 o'clock this morning, the board of directors instituted a new compliance protocol regarding new partners. We are no longer accepting paper trails or promises of incoming wires without immediate verification. The market is too volatile for trust me. We require cleared funds or hard assets. Right now. The color drained from Preston's face so rapidly, it looked as if a drain plug had been pulled in his heels. He sat there, mouth slightly agape, staring at the rejected document as if it had personally betrayed him. But that is impossible, Preston stammered. his voice dropping to a frantic whisper. The wire is initiated. You cannot change the rules in the middle of the game. I do not make the rules, Mr. Claymore. I enforce them, Silas replied coldly. He turned his wrist to check his watch again, a gesture that seemed to suck the oxygen out of the room. And frankly, this hesitation is concerning. Mr. Sterling's funds have been sitting in our account for 48 hours. He is eager. You seem encumbered. Preston turned to our father. The panic in his eyes was raw and animalistic. He leaned in close, his hand gripping Conrad's forearm so tightly his knuckles turned white. "Dad," Preston hissed, his voice trembling just loud enough for me to hear from my corner. "It is a technical glitch. The Zurich servers are down for maintenance. I swear to you, the money is there. I just need a bridge, a temporary bridge, 24 hours. Once the system comes back online, I will pay you back. I will pay you back double." Conrad looked at his son. For a fleeting second, I saw doubt in my father's eyes. He knew Preston's history. He knew about the failed startups and the lost investments. But then he looked at Silas, the embodiment of the power and prestige Conrad so desperately craved to be associated with again. And then he looked at the open briefcase, imagining the millions of dollars that a partnership with Meridian would bring to the family name. Greed is a powerful anesthetic. It numbs the part of the brain that screams danger. "How much time do we have?" Conrad asked Silas, his voice tight. "I have a dinner reservation at Gibson's in 20 minutes, Silas said, closing his portfolio halfway. "I need to leave this room in 10 minutes. If we do not have a signed agreement and secured capital by then, I am calling New York and telling them to onboard Mr. Sterling." 10 minutes. The time frame was arbitrary, manufactured solely to induce panic, but to them, it was a guillotine blade hovering inches above their necks. "We cannot let this slip away. Conrad," my mother interjected. She was gripping the edge of the table, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and avarice. "Think of the humiliation. If word gets out that Preston was rejected, it would ruin us. We have already told the country club. We have already told the neighbors." "I know. Victoria, I know," Conrad snapped, wiping sweat from his upper lip. "Just do it," she urged him, her voice hard. "Preston said he has the money. It is just a computer error. We help him now, and next week we are whole again, plus interest. It is simple business." They discussed the fate of our family finances as if they were ordering dinner, completely ignoring the fact that their simple business was built on a foundation of lies. Not once did they look at me. Not once did they ask the person in the room who actually managed the household bills if this was feasible. I was a ghost to them, a piece of furniture that breathed. I stood perfectly still, my hands clasped behind my back, watching them dig their own graves. "Mr. Silas," Conrad said, straightening his tie and trying to regain some semblance of authority, "we are prepared to offer a collateral guarantee, a temporary measure to secure the seat until the wire clears tomorrow." Silas paused. He looked at Conrad, then at Preston. He drummed his fingers on the table for a moment, feigning reluctance. "Collateral," Silas mused. "It is unorthodox for a personnel buy-in. Usually we prefer cash. Cash does not require appraisal. Cash does not require legal filings." "The Claymore estate," Preston blurted out. "The house. It is worth $3 million. That is more than 10 times the buy-in amount. It is the ultimate security." I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. The house, the one thing they had left, the place where I had grown up, where I had been ignored, where I had hidden in the library to read books on economics while they threw parties I wasn't invited to. It was a crumbling monument to their vanity, but it was their only shelter. "The house?" Silas raised an eyebrow. "Is it unencumbered?" "Completely," Conrad lied. "We own it free and clear." That was another lie. I knew they had a second mortgage on it, but the equity was still enough to cover the $250,000 buy-in. "Very well," Silas said, sighing as if he were doing them a massive favor. "I suppose, given the reputation of the Claymore family, I can make an exception to the cash-only rule. But we need to move fast. He reached into his briefcase again. This time, he did not pull out a folder. He pulled out a document that was already stapled and flagged with yellow sticky notes. As it happens, Silas said, his voice smooth as silk. I always carry a standard conditional asset transfer agreement for our real estate acquisitions. We can adapt this. It essentially states that you are pledging the deed of the property as security for the $250,000 capital contribution. If the cash is not received by the deadline, the property ownership transfers to Meridian Sovereign Holdings to cover the default. He slid the document across the table. You have 5 minutes to review and sign, Silas said. Or I walk. Preston grabbed the document. He didn't read it. He didn't check the clauses. He didn't look at the default terms or the grace period which I had set to 0. He just looked for the signature line. It is standard, Dad, Preston said, pushing the paper toward Conrad. Just legalese. Sign it. I will have the money to them by noon tomorrow, and we rip this up. It is just a formality. Conrad hesitated. He looked at the document. It was thick, dense with legal jargon. A smart man would have called a lawyer. A cautious man would have asked for 24 hours to review. But Conrad Claymore was neither smart nor cautious. He was a desperate man trying to buy back his glory days. Victoria. Conrad looked at his wife one last time. Sign it, Conrad, she said, her eyes fixed on the imaginary fortune that awaited them. Do not be a coward. Preston is the new partner. This is our future. The pen was in his hand. I watched the tip of the pen hover over the paper. At that moment, the silence in the room was deafening. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the minibar. I could hear the traffic 40 floors down. They were signing away their lives based on the word of a son who had never told them the truth a day in his life. And they were doing it to impress a man who was essentially my employee. Wait, I said. The word hung in the air. For the first time in an hour. 3 heads snapped toward me. My mother looked furious. Preston looked annoyed. My father looked confused. What did you say? Conrad asked. I said wait, I repeated, my voice quiet but steady. You haven't read the default clause. If the money doesn't clear in 24 hours, the transfer is immediate. There is no grace period. You will lose the house instantly. Shut up, Priscilla, Preston shouted, slamming his hand on the table. You know nothing about this. You are a secretary. Go back to wiping the counter. She is right, Conrad, my mother hissed, glaring at me with pure venom. She is trying to sabotage him. She has always been jealous of Preston. She wants him to fail so she can feel better about her miserable little life. Ignore her. I am not jealous, I said, looking straight at my father. I am just counting. Be quiet, Priscilla, Conrad said, his voice low and dangerous. One more word, and you can walk home. He turned back to the document. He didn't want to hear the truth. He wanted the lie. The lie was comfortable. The lie promised him status. He pressed the pen to the paper. The scratching sound of his signature was loud in the quiet room. Conrad Claymore. Then he passed the pen to Preston. Preston Claymore. It was done. Silas reached out and took the document. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply checked the signatures, nodded once, and placed the paper into his crocodile briefcase. Excellent, Silas said. The transaction is recorded. He snapped the locks of the briefcase shut. Click, click. The sound was like the closing of a prison cell door. They just didn't realize they were on the inside yet. The document lying on the center of the polished mahogany table was not just a piece of paper. It was a death warrant for the Claymore legacy, drafted in standard 12-point font. It was the deed to the Claymore Manor. To understand the gravity of this moment, you have to understand the house. It was a sprawling 10-bedroom estate in Lake Forest, built in 1922 by my great-grandfather. It had limestone walls, slate roofs, and a garden that had once been featured in Architectural Digest. It was the only place my father had ever lived. It was the physical manifestation of the Claymore identity. Without that house, They were just another pair of aging socialites with maxed-out credit cards. And Conrad Claymore was holding a Mont Blanc pen, hovering over the signature line that would put that entire history on the chopping block. The silence in the room was thick, heavy with the unsaid. Silas sat like a stone idol, his face impassive, waiting for the sacrifice. I knew I had to play my part. The script called for me to be the voice of reason that they would inevitably reject. I had to give them one last chance to save themselves, knowing full well that their arrogance would not allow them to take it. It was the final test of their character. "Dad," I said, my voice trembling with a carefully calibrated mixture of fear and desperation. I took a half step forward, violating the invisible boundary they had set between the partners and the help. "Dad, please, look at what you are signing. That is our home. That is the only asset we have left." The reaction was instantaneous and violent. Preston whipped his head around, his eyes bulging with manic intensity. The stress of the last 20 minutes had frayed his nerves to the breaking point, and he needed a target. I was the perfect target. "Shut up!" Preston screamed, spit flying from his mouth. "Just shut your mouth, Priscilla. What do you know about big business? What do you know about leverage? You spend your life clipping coupons and filing invoices. This is how the real world works. You have to risk big to win big." He turned to our father, his voice shifting from aggression to pleading. "Dad, ignore her. She is trying to sabotage me. She has never wanted me to succeed. She is terrified that I'm going to eclipse her pathetic little existence. This is standard collateral. It is just for 24 hours. Once the Zurich wire hits, the house is safe. We get the deed back tomorrow." I looked at my father. Conrad Claymore was a man who had spent his entire life being told he was special. He had inherited his wealth, squandered his opportunities, and blamed the world for his decline. Now, faced with a decision between prudence and vanity, he was looking at his son, the son who was a mirror image of his own failures, and seeing a hero. He looked at me with cold, hard eyes. There was no love in them. There was only contempt for the witness of his desperation. "Your brother is right," Conrad said, his voice dripping with disdain. "You have always been risk-averse. Priscilla, you lack the stomach for greatness. Do not let your cowardice infect your brother. This is the boldness required of successful men. We are Claymores. We do not cower in the face of opportunity." "But Dad," I whispered, gripping the back of a chair as if to steady myself. "If the money does not come, if there is no Zurich account, you will be homeless. Silas will own the manor. Tonight." "The money is there," Conrad roared, slamming his hand on the table. "I trust my son, I trust the vision, and I will not have a secretary tell me how to manage my estate." He turned back to the document. He did not read the terms. He did not read the paragraph that Silas had highlighted, the one that explicitly stated, "Upon failure to remit the capital contribution of $250,000 within 24 hours. The ownership of the property located at 1400 Lakeshore Drive shall transfer irrevocably to Meridian Sovereign Holdings, with immediate eviction rights." He simply saw the line that said, "Guarantor." Conrad pressed the nib of the pen to the paper. The sound was distinct in the quiet room. Scritch, scratch. It was a sharp, tearing sound, like a blade slicing through silk. He signed his name with a flourish, the large loops of the C taking up more space than necessary. A final act of ego on a document that stripped him of everything. He pushed the paper toward Preston. "There," Conrad said, breathing heavily. "It is done. The Claymore name stands behind this deal." Silas did not blink. He simply rotated the document toward Preston. "And now, Mr. Claymore, your signature on the promissory note. You are certifying, under penalty of perjury and civil forfeiture, that the funds are in transit and will be cleared by 3 o'clock tomorrow afternoon." Preston grabbed the pen. His hand was shaking so badly that he had to steady it with his other hand. He knew, deep down, in the pit of his stomach, he knew he was signing his own execution order. He knew there was no money in Zurich. He knew there was no escrow. He was gambling that he could find a miracle in the next 24 hours, or perhaps talk his way out of it later. But he couldn't stop now. He had already dragged his parents to the edge of the cliff. He couldn't admit he had no parachute. He signed, Preston Claymore. The signature was jagged, tight, and desperate. Silas reached out and took the papers. He examined them with the precision of a forensic accountant. He checked the dates. He checked the signatures. He checked the notary seal that he had brought with him. "Very good," Silas said, his voice even. "The transaction is complete. The deed is held in escrow by Meridian. The clock starts now." He placed the documents into his briefcase and closed it firmly. The sound marked a point of no return clear, decisive, and irreversible. I stood in the corner, my face composed with practiced sorrow, while my heart beat with a calm, deliberate rhythm. My father had just called me a coward. He had called me a failure. He had told me I lacked the resolve for greatness. He had no idea. I had just orchestrated the most decisive takeover in our family's history, and I had done it without raising my voice. I had allowed them to trap themselves using their own assumptions. My father believed he was sacrificing a minor piece to protect the most important one. He believed he was trading short-term safety for lasting power. He did not truly understand the game. He did not realize that he had just sacrificed his castle to save a fool, and the game was already over. "Well," my mother said, her voice high and brittle, breaking the tension. "That is settled then. We are partners." She looked at Preston, her eyes shining with a frantic hope. "You are a partner. Darling, we did it." "Yes," Preston said, wiping sweat from his forehead with his sleeve, ruining the line of his suit. "We did it." They smiled at each other, a grotesque tableau of shared delusion. They were celebrating their own funeral. I turned away, ostensibly to refill the water pitcher, but in reality, to hide the fact that my expression had shifted. The look of the scared, incompetent daughter was gone. In its place was the cold, calculating stare of the new owner of the Claymore Manor. The guillotine had fallen. They just hadn't felt the blade yet. The ink on the document was barely dry. Yet the transformation in the room was immediate and grotesque. It was as if a heavy, suffocating blanket had been lifted, replaced instantly by a manic, feverish energy. The moment the latch on Silas's briefcase clicked shut, sealing the deed to our home inside his possession. Preston slumped back in his chair, but it was not a slump of defeat. It was the exaggerated, sprawling posture of a man who believes he has just conquered the world. He loosened his tie, undoing the top button of his shirt with a trembling hand that he tried to pass off as casual. The color returned to his cheeks, flushing them with a hectic red. The terror that had reduced him to a stuttering mess only 60 seconds ago evaporated, replaced by the toxic arrogance that had defined his entire adult life. He had survived the cliff edge, or so he thought, and in his mind, survival was synonymous with victory. Silas, for his part, remained professional. He took a heavy brass stamp from his side pocket, inked it on a pad, and pressed it firmly onto his copy of the agreement. "Transaction recorded," Silas said. His voice was flat, devoid of the celebratory tone my family clearly expected. He looked at the paperwork, then at Preston, with an expression that was almost pitying. Had the man been capable of pity, Preston ignored the lack of warmth. He let out a loud, braying laugh and slapped the table with his palm. "There it is," Preston crowed, spinning his chair around to face me. "Did you see that? Scylla, did you watch carefully? That is how the big boys play the game. That is how men handle pressure. You stare into the abyss, and you make the abyss blink." He ran a hand through his hair, styling it back into place. "You were over there shaking in your cheap heels, crying about the house, terrified we were going to lose everything. That is why you are an administrative assistant, and I am a partner. It is about vision. It is about having the stones to put everything on the line because you know you are going to win." I stood by the wet bar, my hand gripping the handle of the crystal water pitcher. I said nothing. I just watched him. It was fascinating, in a morbid way. to see how quickly the human mind could rewrite history. He had been begging our father to save him a minute ago. Now, he was the hero of his own story. "Oh, stop scowling. Priscilla," my mother chimed in. She was fanning herself with a napkin, her face glowing with triumph. "Your brother just secured the future of this family. You should be thanking him. You should be on your knees thanking him for his bravery." She turned to Conrad, her eyes sparkling. "Conrad, darling, imagine the gala we can throw next month. Now that we are officially partners with Meridian, we will be the toast of Chicago. We can finally snub the Hendersons. God, I have hated the way that woman looks at our hedges for years. When Preston's first distribution check clears, we should buy their property just to evict them. Turn it into a guest house. Or a garage." "A garage sounds perfect," Conrad agreed, chuckling as he poured himself the last of the flat water from his glass, pretending it was fine wine. "Preston will need space for his new fleet. A partner cannot drive a 3-year-old leasing loaner." "Exactly," Preston said, leaning back and putting his feet up on the rung of the chair next to him, a chair that belonged to a 5-star hotel suite he hadn't paid for. "I am thinking Italian, something low to the ground and loud. And as for living arrangements, I am done with the suburbs. I need a pad in the city, a penthouse in the Gold Coast, floor-to-ceiling windows, maybe a private elevator." He looked at me again, his eyes narrowing with a cruel, playful glint. "Don't worry, little sister," he sneered. "I won't leave you out in the cold. When I get my penthouse, I will make sure it has a maid's room. You can stay there rent-free. All you have to do is keep the place tidy, and maybe iron my shirts before my meetings. It will be a step up from whatever closet you are living in now. Consider it charity." "That is very generous of you, Preston," my mother said, nodding approvingly. "We must always take care of the less fortunate members of the family. It is the Christian thing to do, Priscilla. Say thank you to your brother." They were planning their empire. They were spending money they didn't have, based on a wire transfer that didn't exist. Secured by a house they had just forfeited, they were so drunk on their own delusion that they had completely forgotten there was a stranger in the room. Silas was still sitting at the head of the table. He hadn't moved. He hadn't left for his dinner reservation. He was watching them with the cold, clinical detachment of a scientist observing rats in a maze who think they have found the cheese, not realizing they have walked into the electric grid. Preston finally seemed to remember he was not alone. He turned back to Silas, grinning. "Well, mister?" "Silas," Preston said, waving a hand dismissively toward me. "I think this calls for a toast. Priscilla, stop standing there like a statue. Open the champagne, the vintage bottle. Chop chop, your brother is thirsty." "Yes, hurry up," my father added, checking his watch. "We should celebrate before we head down to dinner. I'm sure Mr. Silas would join us for a glass, to the Claymore resurgence." I looked at the bottle of Dom Perignon sitting in the silver bucket. It was sweating. I looked at Preston, with his feet up and his smirk. I looked at my mother, who was already mentally redecorating a penthouse she would never set foot in. And then I looked at Silas. He gave me the slightest, almost imperceptible nod. It was the signal. The play was over. The curtain was coming down. I did not reach for the champagne. Instead, I lifted the heavy crystal water pitcher. I held it for a second, feeling its weight, the cold glass biting into my palm. Then, I brought it down hard on the marble countertop of the wet bar. Slam! The sound was explosive. It cracked through the air like a gunshot. Water sloshed violently over the rim, splashing onto the floor and soaking the sleeve of my cheap blouse. The room went dead silent. Preston jumped, his feet slipping off the chair rung. My mother gasped, clutching her pearls. Conrad froze, his mouth half open. They all turned to look at me. They expected to see me flustered. They expected to see me apologizing, scrambling to clean up the mess, begging for forgiveness for my clumsiness. That was the Priscilla they knew. That was the Priscilla they had created. But that Priscilla was not there. I stood tall. My shoulders were back. My chin was up. I wiped a drop of water from my hand with a slow, deliberate motion. I looked at Preston, And for the first time in my life, I did not look at him with fear or envy or sadness. I looked at him with absolute, terrifying clarity. "What the hell is wrong with you?" Preston barked, recovering from the shock. "You clumsy idiot! Look at the mess! Clean it up and pour the damn wine." I locked eyes with him. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet. "No," I said. The word hung there, suspended in the silence. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a complaint. It was a verdict. "Excuse me," my mother said, her voice trembling with indignation. "What did you just say to your brother?" I walked out from behind the wet bar. I didn't walk like a servant anymore. I walked with the stride of a CEO entering a boardroom she owned. I walked until I was standing right next to Silas. "I said no," I repeated, my voice calm, level, and cold enough to freeze the water I had just spilled. "There will be no champagne." My father's face turned a shade of purple that usually precedes a cardiac event. He started to rise from his chair. His finger pointed accusingly at my chest, ready to unleash a torrent of verbal abuse about my insolence, my ingratitude, and my disruption of his triumphant moment. "Priscilla, you ungrateful little—" I turned my head and met his gaze. I did not blink. I did not flinch. I channeled every ounce of the cold, hard authority I had cultivated in the boardrooms of Chicago over the last decade. It was a look that had made seasoned CEOs stutter during merger negotiations. "Sit down. Conrad," I said. The command was quiet, but it cracked through the room like a whip. My father froze. He looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time in years. He didn't see the daughter who fetched his slippers. He saw a stranger with eyes like shards of ice. The sheer force of my will pushed him back down into his seat. He was too stunned to speak. "You wanted to see a presentation," I said, walking toward the large LCD screen mounted on the wall. "You wanted to see the vision of the future. You wanted to know who holds the keys to the kingdom. Very well, let me show you." I pulled my phone from my pocket. I didn't need a cable. I had hacked into the room's secure audiovisual network 10 minutes ago while I was pretending to arrange the coasters. I tapped the screen once. Beep, the 60-inch monitor flickered to life. The Meridian Sovereign Holdings logo appeared, a golden lion holding a key. "Preston," I said, my voice cutting through the silence. "You asked who the partners are. You asked who had the capital to back your genius. Look at the screen." I swiped left. Slide 1, corporate governance structure. The diagram was simple, a pyramid. At the bottom, the various shell companies I used to buy distressed debt. In the middle, Meridian Sovereign Holdings. And at the top, the single controlling entity, chairman of the board and sole beneficiary Priscilla Claymore. The silence that followed was not empty. It was heavy, suffocating, sucking the air out of the room. Preston stared at the screen. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The glass of whiskey in his hand tilted, spilling amber liquid onto his expensive trousers, but he didn't even notice the stain spreading across his thigh. That is a typo," Preston whispered, his voice trembling. "That is a joke. You hacked the screen. You put your name on a slide. Very funny. Priscilla, now turn it off." "I do not make jokes about equity." "Preston," I replied. "I own Meridian. I built it. I funded it. And I am the one who decided to interview you today." "You," my mother screeched, clutching the edge of the table. You are a secretary. You make $30,000 a year. You drive a Honda. How could you possibly own a private equity firm?" "I make $30,000 a year at my day job because it keeps you from asking me for money," I said, not looking at her. "I made $14 million last year from shorting the logistics sector, the same sector Preston just said was booming." I swiped again. Slide 2. Target Asset Financial Health. Preston Claymore. The screen changed. It was no longer a corporate chart. It was a forensic dissection of my brother's life. On the left, a pie chart showing his spending luxury travel, gambling, undocumented cash withdrawals. On the right, the cold, hard numbers in red, Current checking balance, negative $4,212. Outstanding credit card liability, $85,640. Private loan, unsecured, $120,000. This is your reality, Preston, I said, walking closer to him. You are not a venture capitalist. You are an insolvent gambler. You didn't come here to invest. You came here to steal from Mom and Dad to pay off a bookie in the South Side. That is a lie. Preston screamed, standing up now, his face pale with terror. Those are fake numbers. I have accounts in Switzerland. I showed you the papers. Ah, yes, the papers, I said. Let's talk about the papers. I swiped to the third slide. Slide 3, Digital Forensic Analysis, Exhibit A. It was a blown-up image of the Swiss bank statement Preston had handed to Silas earlier, but this version was covered in digital markers. I had my tech team run a spectral analysis on the PDF you emailed to yourself to print this morning, I explained, my voice clinical, like a coroner determining the cause of death. See these artifacts around the numbers? That is pixel distortion. It happens when you copy and paste text layers in Adobe Photoshop. I pointed to the date stamp on the document. And here, I continued, the font is Helvetica Neue. The bank you claim to use switched their official typeface to Garamond 2 years ago. You didn't just forge a document, Preston. You did a bad job of it. I turned to face him fully. Do you know what this is? I asked. This isn't just a lie. This is wire fraud. This is bank fraud. And since you presented this document to a registered financial institution, my company, to secure a financial advantage, you have just committed a federal felony, violation of Title 18, United States Code, Section 1343. Preston collapsed back into his chair. He looked like he had been shot. The arrogant smirk was gone, replaced by the hollow, haunted look of a man watching the walls of his cell close in. Priscilla, my father stammered, his voice weak. Priscilla, stop this. We can explain. He meant well. He just needed a start. We can fix this. Just tell your boss to cancel the deal. My boss. I laughed. A short, sharp sound. I am the boss, Dad. There is no one else. And I am not in the business of fixing your mistakes anymore. I turned my back on them and looked at Silas, who was still sitting at the head of the table, watching the carnage with professional interest. Mr. Silas, I said. Report. Silas stood up immediately. The terrifying, imposing man who had made my father cower buttoned his jacket and bowed his head slightly in my direction. It was a gesture of absolute deference. Madam Chairwoman, Silas said, his voice crisp and clear. The conditional asset transfer agreement signed by Conrad and Preston Claymore was uploaded to the Cook County Recorder of Deeds electronic portal 3 minutes ago. The timestamp is verified. He paused, letting the words hang in the air. The lien has been perfected, Silas continued. Title to the property located at 1400 Lakeshore Drive has officially transferred to Meridian Sovereign Holdings. The eviction notice has been filed. Legally speaking, the individuals in this room are currently trespassing on corporate property. The scream that came out of my mother's throat was primal. It was the sound of a woman watching her entire world disintegrate. You bitch, Victoria shrieked. She lunged. It was a blur of movement. My mother, the woman who prided herself on elegance and decorum, flew across the room with her claws bared, aiming for my face. She wanted to hurt me. She wanted to erase me. But she never reached me. Silas moved with a speed that belied his age. He stepped in front of me, his broad shoulder acting as a shield. He caught my mother's wrist in midair, not roughly, but with the firm, immovable grip of a man who dealt with security threats for a living. I would not do that, Mrs. Claymore, Silas said, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. Assaulting a corporate officer is another felony we can add to the list, and unlike your son, I do not think you would survive federal prison. My mother froze, panting, her eyes wild. She looked at Silas, then at me. She saw the unshakable wall between us. She saw the power dynamic that had completely inverted. I stepped out from behind Silas. I didn't look scared. I adjusted my cuffs. "Sit down, Mother," I said. "We are not finished. I have one more slide." Conrad Claymore collapsed back into his leather chair. It was not a graceful descent. It was the physical crumbling of a man whose entire reality had just been shattered by a PowerPoint slide. He stared at the screen, his mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled from the water, gasping for air that was no longer there. He looked at the forensic analysis of Preston's fraud, then at the deed transfer confirmation, and finally at his son. The realization hit him with the force of a freight train. The house was gone. His legacy was gone. And the architect of his destruction was not the economy, or the market, or bad luck. It was the daughter he had ignored for 30 years. I watched him crumble. I felt nothing. No pity, no remorse. Just the cold satisfaction of a calculation that had finally resolved to zero. "This cannot be happening," Conrad muttered, his voice barely a whisper. "The manor. My father built that house. It is impossible." "It is very possible, Father," I said, my voice cutting through his murmurs. "In fact, it is already done. The law does not care about your sentimentality. It cares about signatures. And you signed?" I turned my attention to Preston. He was shaking violently now, the adrenaline of his arrogance replaced by the visceral terror of a trapped animal. He knew what wire fraud meant. He knew what happened to soft, pampered boys in federal prison. I walked over to the table and placed a single sheet of paper in front of him. "Preston, look at me," I commanded. He looked up, his eyes red and watery. "You have two choices," I said, holding up 2 fingers. "And because I am a generous chairman, I will let you pick your poison." "Shush." "Choice number 1, I continued, pointing to the screen. "Silas calls the FBI right now. We hand over the forged bank statements, the digital footprint of your Photoshop activity, and the sworn affidavit from my forensic team. You attempted to defraud a registered equity firm of $250,000. With your prior record of financial negligence, which I also have on file, you are looking at 15 years in a federal penitentiary, minimum. You will be 50 years old when you get out." Preston let out a choked sob. "No, please. Scylla, don't." "Choice number 2, I said, tapping the paper on the table. "You sign this. It is a full and irrevocable renunciation of any claim to the Claymore family inheritance, present and future. It also includes a restraining order. You will leave Chicago tonight. You will not contact me. You will not contact mother or father. You will not use the Claymore name for business ever again. You will disappear. If you do this, I will bury the evidence of the fraud. I will not call the feds. You walk away with your freedom, but with nothing else." The room was silent. The hum of the air conditioning sounded like a roar. Preston looked at the paper. Then he looked at our parents. He scrambled out of his chair and fell to his knees in front of Victoria, grabbing her skirt like a toddler. Mom, please," Preston wailed, tears streaming down his face, ruining his expensive shirt. "Don't let her do this. She is crazy. She stole the house. Tell her to stop. Help me." Victoria looked down at him. For 35 years, she had coddled him. She had bailed him out. She had excused every failure, every lie, every theft. She had loved him with a blindness that was almost pathological. But now, she looked at him, and she saw the truth. She saw the man who had lied to her face 5 minutes ago. She saw the man who had tricked her into signing away her home. She saw the reason she was now destitute. "You said the money was in Zurich," Victoria whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of grief and rage. "You swore to me. Preston, you swore on your grandfather's grave that the money was there. I was going to fix it," Preston blubbered. "I just needed time, Mom. Please." Victoria pulled her skirt out of his grip. She stepped back, her face hardening into a mask of absolute betrayal. The illusion was broken. The golden child was just tarnished brass. "You lost my house," she said. her voice icy. You lost everything. She turned her face away from him. Preston gasped, looking at Conrad. Dad. Conrad didn't even look at him. He was staring at the wall, a broken man. Sign the paper. Preston, Conrad said hollowly. Do what she says. Preston slumped against the table leg. Defeated. He realized, finally, that he was alone. The safety net he had bounced on his entire life had been cut. I uncapped a pen and held it out to him. Sign it, I said, or I make the call. Preston took the pen with a shaking hand. He crawled back to the chair and scribbled his name on the line. It was a messy, ugly scrawl. As soon as the pen lifted from the paper, Silas stepped forward and snatched the document away, placing it securely in the briefcase. Get him out of here, I said to Silas. Silas nodded to the two large security guards who had been waiting just outside the door. They entered the room. Silent and efficient, they grabbed Preston by the arms. No. Wait. I need to say goodbye, Preston screamed as they dragged him backward. Mom, Dad, I am sorry. His parents did not turn around. The doors closed, cutting off his wails. I stood there, smoothing the lapels of my blazer. The room felt cleaner now. I turned to my parents. They were huddled together, looking small and old. They looked at me with fear. They didn't know what I was going to do to them. They expected me to throw them out on the street, just as I had done to Preston. Now, regarding your living situation, I said, my tone shifting to professional indifference. My mother flinched. Priscilla, please. We have nowhere to go. We are old. I know, I said. And unlike Preston, I do not discard useful assets if they can be rehabilitated. I walked over to the window and looked out at the Chicago skyline. You can stay in the manor, I said, not turning around to face them. I heard my mother let out a gasp of relief. Oh, thank God. Thank you, Priscilla. I knew you had a heart. I knew you wouldn't. I am not finished, I interrupted, turning back to glare at them. You can stay in the house, but not as owners. I own the house. You will live there as my tenants. You will sign a standard lease agreement. The rent will be $1 a month. Conrad looked up, confused. $1. $1. I confirmed. But there is a condition. A non-negotiable clause in the lease. I stepped closer, leaning in so they could see the resolve in my eyes. Preston is never to set foot on the property again, I said. He is not allowed through the gates. He is not allowed in the driveway. If I find out that you have let him in, if I find out you have given him $1 of my money, if I find out you have even let him sleep in the garage, the lease is void. I will evict you immediately, and I will sell the house to a developer who will bulldoze it to build condos. Do you understand? Victoria began to cry again, but this time it was a soft, defeated weeping. How can you be so cruel? He is your brother. He is our son. How can you ask us to cut him off? It is unnatural. Cruel? I laughed, shaking my head. I am not being cruel, Mother. I am being pragmatic. I am simply applying the investment strategy that Father taught me. I looked at Conrad. You told me. You have to be bold. You told me. Sentimentality is for the weak. Well, I learned. You hold on to winners, and you liquidate losers. I gestured to the empty chair where Preston had sat. Preston is a toxic asset, I said coldly. He is a liability on the balance sheet of this family. He has drained your capital, your reputation, and your spirit for 20 years. I am just balancing the books. I am liquidating the bad debt so the rest of the entity can survive. You should be thanking me for saving you from your own bad investment. Conrad stared at me. In his eyes, I saw a flicker of something that wasn't fear. It was respect. It was the terrified respect of a man looking at a predator that had outgrown him. $1 a month, Conrad whispered. We accept. Good, I said. I picked up my phone and disconnected it from the screen. The image of my empire vanished, leaving the room screen blank. Silas will have the lease papers drawn up by the morning, I said. He will drive you home now. I suggest you go straight to bed. You look exhausted. I walked toward the door. My heels clicked rhythmically on the hardwood floor. It was the sound of victory. "Priscilla," my mother called out weakly. I stopped, my hand on the brass handle. "Yes." "Will you be coming home for dinner on Sunday?" she asked. Her voice was hesitant, stripped of all its former arrogance. She was asking the landlord, not the daughter. "I don't think so," I said, looking back over my shoulder. "I have a company to run, and I prefer to dine with partners who bring value to the table." I opened the door and walked out into the hallway. I didn't look back. Behind me, in the silence of that expensive room, I left the ruins of the Claymore dynasty, but ahead of me, the elevator doors were opening. Bright and inviting, I stepped inside and pressed the button for the lobby. As the doors closed, shutting out the past, I finally allowed myself to smile. It wasn't a smile of revenge. It was a smile of freedom. The debt was paid. The account was closed. And for the first time in my life, I was in the black. Thank you so much for listening to this story. That was quite a ride, wasn't it? I would love to know where you are tuning in from today. Are you listening from a busy city like Chicago? Or somewhere quiet and peaceful? Please drop a comment below and let me know your location and what you thought of Priscilla's ultimate revenge. If you enjoyed this story, please make sure to subscribe to BitterSweet Drama Stories. Hit that like button and smash the hype button to help this video reach more people who love a good justice drama. Your support means the world to us. See you in the next story.